This is a work session of the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow. We're going to start things off tonight with a presentation from AECOM with an update on the cleanup on the former Duracell plant and the surrounding neighborhood. Gentlemen. Yes, please.
So good evening. My name is Mike Doherty with AECOM.
I'm Brian Turner, representing P&G.
And thanks very much to give us some time to provide this update. Just wanted to walk through the status of the remediation on the individual properties. We brought a figure here that really summarizes the investigation program that was conducted years ago now, and then the residential properties that were remediated and a portion of the village parking lot and the grass area. And to summarize, the investigation program looked at and collected soil samples from 156 properties. 91 of those required remediation and have been completed. We have 2 that were not completed due to access issues with the property owners. We were not able to gain access, so we do have 2 properties that remain unremediated. Brian, you want to add anything to that?
And then just to go on, we're finishing up some of the work with the village in terms of permits and getting signatures to close a lot of the building permits we pulled. And the DEC has reviewed all of that, and we're completing the completion report and submitting that to the DEC as we speak.
Just a quick question. The 2 properties that have not been remediated, let's say those properties change hands in the future. Will you still be available to do the work there?
Yes.
Great.
We will be, DEC will, the New York State DEC will require us, and we will check in every few years to see how that is happening. And one of the properties, I believe, is for sale?
Yes, or has recently changed hands.
Or recently has changed hands, and we're working. We have to first verify the owner and check that. So yeah, we will do that in the future.
It's good to hear. Thanks.
And why would they not have the remediation done? Do you know, or?
Yeah, that's really a question for the individual property owners. We tried multiple times to meet and discuss the remediation that was planned for each property.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Just one more thing on the remediation side. There are degrees of remediation. And I just wondered if the remediation that was done here, if that qualifies to the extent necessary to do construction on those properties. Let's say it was vacant land and somebody wanted to build something. Would a bank provide a mortgage?
Yes, it was cleaned up to an unrestricted use. So residential, whatever end use, they are not restricted for future development.
Terrific. Thank you.
One of the things that could hold up remediation is if they did the testing and came in and said on the property is this is what we found, so this is what we need to do in this specific, this is from previous meetings when you guys have, over the last several years of explaining it. They know what they need to do and where they need to do it on the individual properties. So if I'm a property owner, and it's like, oh, wait a minute, I want you to like redo my entire backyard, and I want you to be, it's like, well, we tested and there's nothing there. It's only this part in the front. And so I say, well, I want you to do the whole thing. And they say, we don't have to. We don't need to, rather. So there's a standoff. And so I'm not going to let you in. It's like, okay, well, you're going to live with the part that needs to be cleaned up then until you finally say yes, but you're not going to pressure us into doing more work than we really need to do. That's one, and there could be the people that just like, this is my property, I don't want anybody on it. So there's various things, but I know there were some discussions, not necessarily these 2 properties, but there were some issues like that over the years with some of the properties.
Yeah, we needed to remove some features that were out of compliance, that were not up to code, and we had to make modifications to bring it into code to be able to get the permit and to do the remediation, and that was part of the negotiations. And to get access, we had to add storm drains galleries so that things could be put back as in kind. So we went through a lot of those, and we made sure that the property owner was happy with the final solution. So various things over the many years that we did this work.
And it would all been easier if the entire village was only, 40 years old instead of,
Right.
but it's not. Anything else you guys want to do to update us, or any questions from anybody?
Just, and Brian mentioned that we're working with the building department. We really appreciate, I don't see Sean here tonight, but greatly appreciate the cooperation that his group and Anthony have shown,
Yeah.
to help us coordinate this really busy project in the village. We've got a handful of open building permits that we still need to close out, but we've got 76 out of 90 or 91 already closed out. We really just have a relative small handful. Groundwater monitoring, and Anthony, I know we've talked a little bit about this, has occurred based on a requirement from DEC, the state, to collect some groundwater data. There's been a couple of rounds of that monitoring, and then some soil vapor monitoring as well as a result of requirements from the state. So we're still working through those items.
And then there's a few other tasks that the DC is requesting us to do, so above and beyond, and we're working with them to complete it. So we've done some soil gas monitoring, some other aspects that we're working on with them, and working through Sean and Anthony to get the access and to do that. But our goal is to continue working with the village and continue working with the New York State DEC to comply with whatever is needed to get done.
Now, let's say there was a change. I know occasionally New York State changes what's permissible and what's not permissible. So let's say they make a change and there are parts of the village that are no longer permissible. How do we handle that?
From the soil remediation, again, since we remediated to a very stringent standard, we don't expect that. But to give you some history on the project, when the plant closed in the late 80s, they remediated to a certain limit, and they got closure from New York State, New York Department of Health, and DEC. Fast forward, there was a change to their limits, and then we came back and dealt with it. And so we would be back if for some reason something came up in the future. Hopefully that's not the case, but yes, we're forever responsible.
So if the standard becomes stricter, then we can expect another 6 or 8 years of.
Hopefully not. We made sure we were conservative on this to make sure that doesn't happen, but yes, anything can happen, and who knows what 10 years from now will hold.
Yeah. Well, they're the people that think we'll be underwater, so it won't matter anyway, so we'll see.
There were also a few village-owned properties, including the senior center. They did testing, the park, Barnhart Park, and the ambulance corps.
Yeah. Okay, any questions? Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you again. Thanks,
Thank
Anthony.
you, guys. It's great to have you come down.
Okay, next discussion items, floating zones. We're looking at doing a special session later on this evening. We've been talking about that and had some, for several weeks now, and completed a public hearing. And we had some changes that we considered and discussed last week. Those have been incorporated. Thanks again to the planning board for their input. And I'd like us to consider that in a special hearing, special session, later on this evening. Likewise, we've had a public hearing on the sidewalk cafe permit to extend to year-round the opportunity to have seating outdoors. And I expect that we will act on that later on this evening as well. And it seems that the consensus is to remove the restriction, to make it a year-round, and essentially when there's a nice day, that business owners will be able to take advantage of the weather and seat people outdoors, provided their other stuff is in order. But I'd like to consider that in the special session as well later on. We're looking at parking restrictions on Valley, Cortlandt, and New Broadway. Mr. Giacchio, you want to, pardon me, Mr. Gross?
Yeah. So we actually had a public meeting several months ago down at the senior center, and one of the comments made by a business owner on Valley was that most of her business occurred at between 7 and 8 o'clock as people are headed to the trains. We discussed the matter with Rich here, who talked about why that restriction was in place, and that's primarily because of the street sweeper. So he sent me a memo suggesting changes that will alleviate that problem, and you have a copy of that memo.
If you follow through on the handout that I gave you, is Valley Street, but it also pertains to Cortlandt Street, because it's the same streets, same time frames, so forth and so on. The benefit would be to the businesses in the morning, that people are running into the bakery, but the restriction at this time is 7 to 7:30, which would really hurt him because the meter person is right behind them. So if they were to pull in, go in and get coffee, they're gonna come out, and it's gonna cost them $35 for a ticket. So for whatever reason, and I'm sure it had something to do with the construction of 124 Valley Street, down to College Avenue on Valley Street, it is 7 to 7:30. From College Avenue to the Village Line, down by McDonald's, it's 9 to 9:30. So not only is it a manpower savings, but it's a savings on the fuel for the sweeper. Because when he would go down Valley Street, now he can only go to College Avenue. Now he has to go down, come up Cortlandt Street, and start at College Avenue and go up. At 9 o'clock, he has to return to the same street and do the lower half on both Cortlandt and Valley. So it's making the street to be in sync with all the other streets. There's no other streets in the village that have split times. Even Beekman Avenue is 7 to 7:30. So I recommend 9 to 9:30. This way the businesses in the morning, cars can stop, get their coffee without getting a summons. And it's the same thing on Cortlandt Street.
I think there are a lot of benefits, you know, it's
Yeah,
consistent, the way we have it now is a little confusing. It's also more difficult for residents who've parked their cars and don't have to get up, you know, at 6:45 to
Right.
move their car. They can do it a little bit later. So I think it's win-win, and I appreciate you doing this, the work behind it.
And we threw in there New Broadway. New Broadway presently is 9 o'clock to 4 o'clock. Well, we leave at 3 o'clock, so there's no reason for that extra hour of no parking. So I recommend that it go from 9 to 12 on the alternate sides.
And why 3 hours? It really does take 3 hours to sweep the whole street?
No, it doesn't, but if you want to reduce it, 9 to 10, that's fine also. I just brought it down from 4 to 3.
One thing to keep in mind is commuters. How many people are going to be willing to park that far away? A couple extra blocks from the train station in Terrytown. You want to make sure that it's blocked out in a way that we're not going to lose our parking spaces to people that are working and spending their money in the city. Because certainly people who live in that neighborhood aren't going to be taking, that advantage of the parking. So we might want to think about that before we do. I would suggest before we do anything with any of the parking downtown is that we look at, as we start to implement the comprehensive plan and potential rezoning and some of the traffic flow issues as well. And as hopefully we start to move towards permit parking on all the streets that are close to the train stations, similar to the Terrytown thing, I think that would be a big benefit for our residents.
So Richie, do you think that the times for New Broadway were related perhaps to commuters parking?
No, I really don't think so. It was
It
always,
almost looks so long, I
it was
mean,
always 9 to 4,
yeah.
always. So if we back it down to 12 o'clock, the residents can go back on the street parking.
And
They don't
it's
have
still-
to wait
it-
till 4
yeah.
o'clock in the afternoon. The only thing it was good for is when we would do snow removal. That's the only benefit.
Lean forward to the microphone.
That's the only benefit was for snow removal. But we put out the signs for snow removal. They have to move if we declare a snow emergency. That's one of the streets.
Okay.
I just have one more question. On the upper part of Valley, when you had it was 7 AM to
7:30
7:30.
from Chestnut
So do you
to
think,
College Avenue.
do you think people moved their car across the street directly? Was there spots, or did they move it down to the section of Lower
They
Valley where
moved
they
it down
could?
to the lower section of
So
Valley.
what are they gonna do now?
Well, now they don't have to come out until 9 o'clock.
But at 9 o'clock, what are they gonna
Yeah.
do?
They'll find a parking space. They found it
Across
from
the street?
They found it from 7 to 7:30 across
They
the
moved
street.
it down
The
because they
opposite
could.
side. You
Is there
move
gonna be
up-
enough spots on the opposite side, you think?
Yeah, if it's Monday, Wednesday, Friday, you move to the Tuesday, Thursday side. And most of them will,
So why wouldn't they do that on the other days, presently?
It's the people driving in to the neighborhood, not the people that are coming outside. It's me driving through and saying, I'm gonna run into the bakery. And the bakery has a disadvantage because if I run in there, I'm probably gonna get a summons it's like in
No,
the
I
morning.
understand that. I
That's
understand
what
that,
we're
but
trying to
if
do
I
it for.
lived there and I was able to just move my car a couple of blocks down on Valley on the same side, right?
yeah,
That's what you said people were
yeah,
doing.
because it was
So
9
now
to
all of that
9:30.
side,
The whole side is no
from
parking.
9 until,
Yeah,
so I'm saying, will there be enough spaces on the opposite side of the street if everybody has to do that?
on the side streets they'll go. They'll go onto the Pikes to
It's
the
just something to
college.
think about.
Yeah. But you rather, you keep it uniform for the sweeper.
I understand
You
that.
You get somebody that's new on the sweeper, substituting in there, they know how to sweep, but they don't know the full hours of the street, so
Mhm.
they know it's from 9 to 9:30, right down the street, and right up Cortlandt Street.
Okay. I'm not arguing that.
Yeah.
I'm just bringing up a point of,
So,
if we create a situation that people don't have anywhere to put their car at 9 o'clock, even 9 o'clock, you know?
It also benefits the bakery on Cortlandt Street now.
so let's do this. Let's put together a chart with the parking restrictions for downtown, the side streets off of Cortlandt and Valley. So as John is pointing out, we know exactly what might be unintended side effect of this. Okay? And we'll come back to it.
Okay,
Thanks.
I'll run that out
Thanks,
for you.
Richie.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Richie.
Right.
Okay,
I have a quick question for Anthony. 'Cause since we talked about parking, where are we with our consultant on her recommendations?
I actually talked to Chief Boetti recently. We'll probably have her back here to give some follow-up on those items, too. I think the latest, we had some recommendations for Lower Beach, and we didn't act on those, but we did get recommendations on that,
Okay, thank you.
some code changes.
Okay. Next up, within the last week was the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, a concentration camp in that saw the slaughter of tens of thousands of people. And it's one of the things that anniversaries bring things back and remind us of the horror that was perpetrated by that government, by the German government. And it's something that we should never forget. A number of communities around us passed resolutions remembering what happened, because we're starting to see more anti-Semitic acts in our own communities, right here in our own schools. And we're seeing it in the form of violence in communities very near to us. And it's something that we need to be loudly against. And one way that a village is loudly against something is by passing a resolution saying we abhor this and we condemn it in the strongest possible terms. And we want to make sure that everybody remembers and also feels the same way that we do about it, and that this kind of behavior is not tolerated. There was a draft resolution that was prepared. Another draft resolution was prepared that's, I think, more appropriate to our village and to our situation by a village resident. And I would like us to consider that and to pass it.
I guess my feeling is, of course, I feel we should pass this resolution. I tend towards the more streamlined version. I appreciate why in the first draft they might want to include some of the incidents that happened, but I think when you start listing the incidents, you're going to leave out important incidents. So I feel like the shorter version is more appropriate.
Other comments?
No, I think the shorter version is very well written, concise, and, I think we should, I'm in favor of adopting this.
Mm-hmm.
Then what I'm going to do is put it on for next week, and we will adopt it then. Okay?
Sounds good.
We had a request for training for court officers. Mr. Giacchio?
Yeah, in your packet is a summary of the seminar both our court clerk and assistant court clerk would like to attend. It's in New York City. There is a stayover. The total cost is just under $700, $693.26. That includes everything. And I know the board has been supportive of ongoing training for our staff. So per our code or our policy, the board has to approve this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, what's the date again? Are we okay by approving?
February 17th and 18th.
Okay, so we could approve it next week
Yeah.
and we're still, all right. Great, so I'll put it on for next week?
Sounds good.
Okay, great. Can I get can I get a resolution to go into a special session?
So moved.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor, say aye.
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 Mayor,
Opposed, abstentions? All right, we're in the special session.
I just
Yes.
have a quick question before we vote on the sidewalk cafe thing. We had a recommendation from the chamber to do it, instead of a year, to do it like from the end of November through, like the same as the farmer's market schedule, sometime in April or something like that. So I just wanted a clarification as to why you guys think it's better to just do 12 months as opposed to what the chamber's recommending.
So, if I can answer, about
Looks like you are going to answer, so take it away.
2 weeks ago, it was 66 degrees on a Sunday. So that might only mean a few hours in the afternoon, but if a business, who I think we all want to support our local restaurants and cafes, coffee shops, and future businesses, because we're making this change for the future also, would be able to avail themselves of outdoor dining for their customers.
And most of their customers are going to be village residents and guests of village residents. So they would have the opportunity, if the weather was nice enough, to enjoy an outdoor meal or drink or whatever. We do see, on occasion these days, in March and November, some very, very nice weather. If a village resident and their families are in town, why not have the opportunity to do that if a business is willing to take the time and trouble? Now, having said that, we have regulations in place in the code to make sure that everything is done appropriately to scale, and that we enforce issues as it relates to noise, loud music, et cetera. And it's incumbent upon the village to make sure that we continue to do that. I think that's really important. But I think it should be up to the business owner and the people who frequent those businesses to decide when is best.
Yeah. So a question for you, Anthony. What was the rationale that we had before to limit it to the months that we
I don't
had?
know. That was a long time ago. I don't know.
I don't know when that was put in, frankly.
Yeah, I thought we discussed all this last week.
Well, we did to some, we didn't really have a long conversation about it, but
Anthony, did we get any more correspondence?
Today, we did get a correspondence from Peter Chafkin at John Hudson, who's in favor of extending the time frame.
okay. I have no further questions.
Your Honor. You're a witness. Okay, the first resolution that I'd like us to consider is on the floating zones. It's rather lengthy, and I would just point out that the resolution is approving a change in the village code. The specific language in the code has been drafted, and we'll be approving that change to the code, and it will be up, assuming we vote to approve it. And the code will be updated with that specific language. And there was something in the language that wasn't as clear as we wanted it to be. It was pointed out by Trustee Levy that we intended this to be for village-owned properties. And the way the code was changed, was drafted, was to say municipal and other property.
Or a government-related entity?
Yeah, and we have no intention of opening this up to MTA properties. That's the only thing I can think of that might be in our downtown that's a government entity, now or in the future. We intend this to be for Village of Sleepy Hollow owned properties or our entities like our local development corporation. So we're changing that in that draft. And to make it as specific as what we've been discussing for the last couple of months. And this is all about, yes, in the end, we control who gets it or not, but we just wanted to be very clear about that.
Yeah, so prior to the meeting, I touched base with every trustee and the mayor on this minor change, but to me, it just caught me as a little unclear. So line, parentheses number 1 would say, the property must be owned by the Village of Sleepy Hollow or one of its entities.
Which paragraph are you in?
Paragraph 1.
One.
It might not be looking.
It's
So
not
the
in
second
it's
one
not
of
a
our
resolution.
new copy that we got.
It's in the code.
It's in the actual
It's in the
code,
code, not the resolution.
which is a
Oh,
little
I'm
long.
sorry.
It's a little lengthy.
I apologize.
Just read what was there before, John.
So what was there prior to the change was the property must be owned by a municipal or government-related entity.
Which is much, much broader than what we ever intended.
Any government-related entity.
Right. And the word we took out prior to even tonight was the property must be owned by, the property must be an existing municipal or government related entity, which made more sense grammatically. But when you take out existing, it's a little unclear, so.
Yeah,
Because we took out the word existing, because if there's a future, we don't want to exclude those. If the LDC acquires a property, for
Right.
example.
So we're specifically saying village-owned properties.
Or one of its entities.
One of its entities, because there are other governmental structures
Got
in the village, like the post office.
True.
yep.
Consulate.
And whatever the NSA is done with, so.
Maybe somebody will open up a consulate up here. You never know.
Yeah, White
A lot
Plains,
of diplomats there.
yeah, that's
I
true.
actually think the county might own property, right? They own the North Tarrytown Housing.
They own
Don't
the
own
park.
that?
Kingsland.
No, but not in the inner village, but they might own. some
Yeah, I guess technically the housing authority.
But they
I
also-
think the housing authority owns its, it's
Okay.
it's its own entity, that everyone I know of, it's not owned by the county, it's, but there are so many restrictions on that kind of property that,
Yeah.
yeah,
So I think this change keeps it in the spirit of what we intended. That's the goal, you know?
Okay, and in that spirit, you want to read the resolution? If Clinton would say, village council would say, read the first whereas, and then the now therefore.
You think that's what we can do here?
All right, you asked, so no, read the whole thing then. Okay, everybody take a paragraph.
I was just making sure. Resolution, Mayor and Board of Trustees, Strategic Property Redevelopment Floating Zone Adoption. Whereas on or about November 26, 2019, the Village of Sleepy Hollow adopted a duly prepared comprehensive plan and local waterfront revitalization program update, which included significant public input, including public hearings and an environmental review as required by the New York State Environmental Quality Review. And whereas the comprehensive plan outlined certain goals and objectives related to the consolidation and potential redevelopment of certain properties owned by the village or village-related entities, many of which are located within the inner village portion of the Village of Sleepy Hollow. And whereas Article 15 of the Code of the Village of Sleepy Hollow provides for the process and procedures for amendments to the village's zoning code. And accordingly, a draft of a proposed floating zone text amendment was prepared for Village Board of Trustees review. And whereas on September 17, 2019, at a regularly scheduled meeting of the Village Board, the Board was provided a presentation from Professor John Nolan from the Pace Center for Land Use Law, which reviewed the general nature and background of land use law, and in specific, the creation and use of zoning and overlay zones. And whereas based on that discussion, certain revisions were made to the draft text, and on December 3rd, 2019, the Village Board opened a duly noticed public hearing in which all members of the public were invited to attend and be heard, and the proposed zoning text amendments were forwarded to other interested agencies as required by law. And whereas correspondence dated December 23rd, 2019, was sent to the village clerk from the Westchester County Planning Board indicating that the matter was one of local determination. And whereas also in December, the village board prepared a full environmental assessment form, Part 1, and circulated it among all interested parties. And whereas as required under Article 15 of the Village Code, the proposed amendments were referred to the Village of Sleepy Hollow Planning Board for review and recommendation. And whereas the Planning Board provided correspondence dated January 20th, 2020 to the Village Board with specific comments and recommendations to the proposed strategic property redevelopment floating zone. And whereas on January 21st, 2020, the Village Board did close the public hearing. And now therefore be it resolved that based on its review of the record, including the full environmental assessment form and coastal assessment form, the Village Board makes the following environmental findings of fact. 1, the creation of a strategic property redevelopment floating zone creates an opportunity for the village to repurpose and redevelop select properties in the inner village neighborhood and return those properties to the tax rolls. 2, The application of the SPR floating zone will be done on a limited case-by-case basis, and each application will be evaluated on its own merits. Resolved that the village board does hereby determine, after careful and considerable review of, among other things, a full environmental assessment form part 2 and a full environmental assessment form part 3, that the proposed SPR floating zone will not have a significant effect on the environment, and that a draft environmental impact statement will not be required. And be it further resolved that the village board determines that the proposed SPR floating zone is consistent with the goals and policies of the village's comprehensive plan and local waterfront revitalization program. And be it further resolved that the village board hereby adopts local law 1, amending section 450 of the Village of Sleepy Hollow Code, and be it further resolved that the village clerk is hereby directed to enter said local law into the minutes of this meeting and in the code book of the Village of Sleepy Hollow, and give due notice of the adoption of said local law to the Secretary of State of the State of New York. So moved.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? The resolution's approved. The second resolution on changing the sidewalk cafe code, or the hours that they may be open. Someone want to read that?
I don't have a copy of it.
There and now, therefore, was there a resolved portion on this?
Just read it, and he said, just make a motion to approve.
Make a motion
Yeah.
to approve this local law, which says.
The first paragraph.
In part, section 1,
Okay.
and then read section 1, and then sidewalk cafes, that's in bold.
Here it is.
Local law,
2.
wait, I'm sorry, where am I? Local law number 2, is that what it
Yeah.
is?
The blank line on top.
Oh, okay, local law number 2 of 2020.
Move
Got it.
that you can read that.
Okay, so
and then
local-
this, down to here.
Got it. Local law amending the code of the Village of Sleepy Hollow at Chapter 362, Streets and Sidewalks by changing the months of operation of sidewalk cafes. Be it enacted by the Board of Trustees of the Village of Sleepy Hollow, New York as follows. Section 1, the code of the Village of Sleepy Hollow is hereby amended at Chapter 362, Streets and Sidewalks, 362-21, Sidewalk Cafes, Paragraph A, to read as follows: Sidewalk cafes. The Village Board of Trustees is hereby authorized to grant permits for the use of the sidewalks for sidewalk cafes upon the following terms and conditions. A, the applicant shall comply with all of the terms and conditions for a sidewalk display permit set forth in 362-20 above, except for that of 362-20A. 1, the permit shall be valid only during a single calendar year and shall permit the regulated activity only during the period from January 1st through December 31st of such years. I'll just read the whole thing.
Okay.
Section 2, the invalidity of any word, section, clause, paragraph, sentence, part, or provision of this law shall not affect the validity of any part of this local law which can be given effect without such invalid part or parts. Section 3, this local law shall take effect immediately upon filing in the office of the Secretary of State. So motion to approve this local law number 2 of 2020.
Seconded.
Moved and seconded. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed or abstentions? The resolution's approved. That completes our business for the evening. Can I get a motion to end the special session?
So moved.
Seconded?
Moved and seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions? Special session is over. We're back on our work session, and our work is complete for the evening. So thank you all, and good night.